Ever notice how sometimes the loudest political fights seem to be about things that don't, well, directly change your day-to-day?
Yeah, or how leaders can get everyone really fired up about one particular issue, maybe an enemy.
Right, while maybe quietly changing rules somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. And that's pretty much what we're getting into today.
We're doing a deep dive into this really interesting piece by Larken Rose. It's called How Tyrants Get You to Cheer for Your Own Oppression.
Provocative title.
It really is. And it digs into that unsettling dynamic we just mentioned.
Yeah, Rose's article, it really dissects these strategies that leaders, and he uses that word leaders, quite deliberately,
Right.
that they've used throughout history, and he argues still used today, to basically get public support for things that actually mean less freedom, more control.
So our mission here is to kind of pull out the core of his argument.
Exactly. Look at his evidence, what he's pointing to, and give you a clearer picture of these, well, political maneuvers without getting lost in, overly academic stuff.
Got it. Okay, so let's kick things off. What's the central idea, the main thrust of Rose's argument?
Well, at its heart, Rose argues that a key tactic, maybe the primary tactic, for those wanting to increase their power is creating, amplifying external threats.
External enemies.
Right. Real or maybe just perceived ones. By getting the public focused on that enemy, they generate this sense of unity, maybe fear, that makes people much more willing to accept, sometimes even demand, measures that at the end of the day serve to oppress them.
Wow, okay, so basically getting people to actively support the tightening of their own chains in a way.
That's the idea he's putting forward.
That's a pretty strong claim.
Yeah.
Does Rose give us any historical grounding for this? Where does he see this pattern?
Oh, he does. He reaches back quite a bit, actually. He points to James Madison, for instance.
Oh, one of the U.S. founding fathers.
Yeah. Madison's warning that oppression in America might actually come disguised, as a necessary response to some foreign threat. And Rose sees that as incredibly relevant today. Think about how often national security concerns are used to justify expanding government power in different areas.
Yeah, right. The whole liberty versus security trade-off.
Yeah.
But maybe the trade isn't always what it seems.
That's exactly his point. And he also goes further back. He references Plato.
Plato. Wow. Okay.
Well, he paraphrases Plato's observation, basically, that when you run out of external enemies, leaders tend to invent new ones.
Why? To maintain their position?
To maintain the public's need for their leadership. It's this recurring theme, this idea that a leader needs an other to rally people against.
It really does start to sound like a kind of playbook, doesn't it? And then Rose brings in a much starker example from the 20th century, right?
He does. He actually quotes Adolf Hitler.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Hitler apparently stated that a key to leadership is concentrating people's attention against just one adversary. Keep it simple, keep it focused. It is. And for Rose, this just starkly illustrates how powerful that focused enemy narrative can be as a tool for, consolidating power and keeping control.
It simplifies everything down to us versus them.
Exactly. Blame one group, focus all the anger there. Yeah. It kind of bypasses critical thinking about other things, perhaps.
So from ancient philosophy to, well, that dark historical example, how does Rose then connect this framework to more recent American politics? You mentioned he focuses on Donald Trump.
He does, yeah. He uses that framework, these historical patterns of identifying enemies, and turns to, contemporary examples. He argues that while Trump presented himself as fighting corruption, fighting the establishment...
But it's a big part of his appeal for many.
Absolutely. But Rose argues a huge part of his strategy involved using that enemy narrative. He specifically brings up the rhetoric aimed at groups Rose lumps together with the term libtards.
Okay. So Rose isn't necessarily debating the political disagreements themselves.
Not primarily, no.
But looking at the function of that focus, how it was used strategically.
That's it, exactly. Rose's point is that while supporters were, intensely focused on those perceived enemies, his administration, at the same time, oversaw expansions in things like state surveillance, government power, even increased taxes through tariffs.
Things that, ironically, are often criticisms leveled against his opponents.
Precisely. So Rose is pointing out this potential disconnect.
So the idea is that the energy, the attention poured into fighting the enemy might have perhaps obscured these other actions.
That's the core of Rose's critique there. And he then looks at the psychological tools that make this dynamic work.
Okay, like what?
Well, fear creation is a big one. If you can cultivate fear of a specific threat, could be external, could be internal.
Right.
Leaders can justify actions that people might otherwise resist much more strongly.
Fear is definitely a powerful motivator in politics. You see that all the time. What else does he highlight?
Tribalism, that's another huge piece. Tapping into that basic human thing, forming groups, favoring your own.
Us versus him.
Exactly. Leaders can exploit that to build intense loyalty within their base and, importantly, discourage critical thinking about their own actions.
Yeah, if you're so strongly against them, you might not question it's quite so hard.
Right. That group loyalty can sometimes just override individual judgment.
And Rose also has this pretty striking analogy he uses for politics, doesn't he? Something about wrestling.
He does, yeah. He calls it the WWF mentality.
WWF. Like professional wrestling.
Exactly. He's comparing politics to that kind of spectacle, the predetermined narratives, the big dramatic confrontations.
The heroes and villains.
Right. It's all emotionally charged, gets the crowd going. But Rose argues it distracts from the actual substance, the real-world consequences. It's about the performance of conflict, maybe not always the reality of it.
That's quite a cynical take. But maybe there's something to it. How much is performance versus substance?
It definitely makes you think. It's a blunt comparison, for sure.
Okay, so let's get into some specific policy areas Rose looks at through this lens. Tariffs, for one, you mentioned.
Yes, tariffs. Rose basically argues that Trump's tariffs functioned effectively as a tax increase on Americans.
Because consumers ultimately pay the higher prices, right?
Generally, yes. But by framing them as punishment against, say, China or other countries?
The external enemy again.
Exactly. The public focus stays on that conflict, potentially obscuring the domestic economic hit. Rose even brings up these reports suggesting Amazon might have been pressured not to display the tariff costs separately at checkout.
Really? So keeping people less aware of the direct cost to them.
That seems to be the implication Rose draws from those reports, that transparency could have disrupted the narrative.
Interesting. Okay, and then there's the Real ID Act. That's been around a while, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. Passed way back in 2005, but took ages to be fully enforced. It sets up federal standards for state IDs, driver's licenses. Rose sees this as a pretty big step towards more centralized control, maybe even a surveillance state.
And his criticism is about who supported or didn't oppose it.
His criticism, specifically in the context of Trump, is that you often hear loud objections to these kinds of measures from conservatives when, say, Democrats propose them.
Right. Concerns about government overreach, national ID cards.
Exactly. But Rose argues there was comparatively less pushback when Trump was in a position to either, support it or try to stop its final implementation.
So the idea is, if your guy's doing it, maybe the scrutiny isn't as intense on those specific policies.
That's the inconsistency Rose is pointing to. He also mentions concerns about what he saw as pushes for more domestic tracking, more militarized policing under the Trump administration.
Yeah.
And again, he frames it as a kind of double standard. These actions might be tolerated or even supported if the main focus is kept firmly on fighting some designated enemy, whether that's foreign terrorists or domestic political opponents.
It keeps coming back to that enemy focus as the key mechanism. What about the whole QAnon thing? Rose addresses that pretty directly too, right?
Oh, very directly. He basically dismisses QAnon as, quote, nonsense.
Strong words.
Yeah. He sees it as offering this false hope, promises of secret plans, mass arrests of some hidden cabal.
Right, the whole narrative.
And his argument is that people who buy into that get so caught up in this, grand, almost fantasy battle against this shadowy enemy
That they might miss what's happening right in front of them.
Exactly. That it distracts them from actually scrutinizing the actions of the people currently in power, the ones whose decisions directly affect their lives and freedoms.
It definitely fits the pattern.
Yeah.
Rose describes this absorbing external battle that takes up all the oxygen.
Yeah, it fits perfectly into his framework.
You mentioned earlier his writing style is distinctive.
That's putting it mildly. Rose's language is really raw. It's direct, often emotional, sometimes pretty vulgar, actually.
Okay.
He uses terms like livestock or, idiots to describe the general populace sometimes.
Wow. It's pretty harsh.
It is. It clearly reflects his deep frustration, maybe even contempt for what he sees as widespread political manipulation and just a lack of critical thinking from the public.
It's definitely a very direct style, almost aggressive. What kind of impact do you think that has? Does it strengthen his case for some, or just push people away?
That's a great question. It's probably a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah, I'd imagine.
That kind of bluntness, it grabs your attention, for sure. But it absolutely risks alienating about manipulation.
Yeah, you might agree with the point, but disagree strongly with how he's making it.
Exactly. Tone matters.
So, okay, as we kind of wrap this up, what's the bottom line? The main takeaway Rose really wants people to get from his article.
The key message, and he puts it very starkly, is basically this. If you can keep a population focused on an enemy, real or imagined, you can exploit, rob, and surveil them with their full support.
Wow, that's chillingly direct.
It is. It's a call, really, to look past the rhetoric, past who the designated bad guy of the moment is.
And look at the action.
Yeah. And critically assess how leaders, how those in power, are actually treating the people they govern. Judge them by their actions towards their own citizens, not just their words about some enemy.
So as you're navigating, the news, social media, all the information flying around, maybe keep this deep dive into Larken Rose's perspective in mind. Think about the stories being told. Who's being set up as the enemy? And maybe more importantly, why? What could be the less obvious result of everyone focusing only on that fight?
Yeah, what are the potential blind spots created by that intense focus?
Exactly. What might be the real-world consequences if we just uncritically accept these us versus them frames in our own lives, in our communities?
Yeah.
It's definitely something worth reflecting on.